Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Let's begin with prayer. Father, as we come to the end of this book, and the end of the semester, we ask that you would focus our attention on the task at hand. We thank you for your word and the way you've confirmed it in our lives. And we ask that you would do so again as we get down to studying it this hour. Help us, we pray, in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we've come to the end of the book. And Moses has given his big exhortation, his third major speech, finishing in chapter 30. And chapter 31, he continues and he introduces a new problem, one that most likely would have been terrifying to the Israelites if you think about it. Chapter 31, verse 1, so Moses continued to speak these words to all Israel. He said to them, I am 120 years old today. I am no longer able to go out and come in. The Lord has said to me, you shall not go over this Jordan. Can you imagine what that would have meant to Israel? Moses, who has led them for 40 years in the wilderness, is an old man now, 120 years old. He is now admitting, recognizing, saying it publicly again, though they probably already knew it. Listen, guys, I'm not going over the Jordan. And although on the one hand, I think people would be sad that Moses is not going to cross over, this creates yet another problem for Israel. And that is, who's going to lead us into the land if it's not you, Moses? Think about that. He has been their leader for a long time. He has been the voice of God for a whole generation. Now, as they stand on the edge of the greatest adventure, if you will, the fulfillment of the promise which God made 400 years ago, the leader who brought them through all this is not going to go with them. It's not going to go. This is a crisis. But notice that Moses is quick to admit, it's no big deal that I'm not going to go with you. Because in the final analysis, I'm not the one that's winning the battles for you. God is your leader. Verse 3, the Lord your God himself will go over before you. I'm not going, but that's okay. In some ways, Moses is acknowledging that he's disposable. It doesn't really matter if Moses goes with them or not. God is going. God himself will go over before you. He will destroy these nations before you so that you shall dispossess them. And you'll also have a human leader. Joshua will go over at your head as the Lord has spoken. And the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and to their land when he destroyed them. The Lord will give them over to you, and you shall do them according to the whole commandment that I have commanded you. Be courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. For 40 years, Israel has had a human leader, leading them through this wilderness, leading them against their enemies. But Moses has done a good job in this book of acknowledging God is the one who's been fighting for you. Remember the exhortation to them as they go into the land and wage war. Don't be afraid. Why? Because you'll have a human leader? No, because God's going to fight for you. Don't be afraid when you see bigger armies. Why? Because Joshua's going to be so strong? No, because God's going to fight for you. When you see chariots with iron wheels, don't be afraid. God's going to fight for you. Now, look, guys, I'm not going in. But don't worry. God is going to go ahead of you. God, through Moses, is anticipating that the people would need this encouragement. Joshua does too. So first he addresses the people in 31, 1 through 6. Then he talks to Joshua specifically. Moses summoned Joshua, verse 7, and said to him, in the sight of all Israel. I mean, this is a charge if ever there was a charge. All Israel is standing there. Joshua comes up, and Moses is going to lay on him, as it were, the mantle of leadership. Be strong and courageous. You shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them. You shall put them in possession of it. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Both parties would be nervous about the situation. The Israelites as a whole and Joshua as an individual. And Moses sets out to give them courage in the one thing that actually matters. God is going over before them. God is giving them this land, so they don't need to be afraid. Remember that at Kadesh Barnea, in the book of Numbers, that's exactly the reason the people didn't go into the land. Because they were afraid. There's such a thing as godly fear, and there's such a thing as ungodly fear. Ungodly fear stands there, and when God says, I'm going to fight for you, you say, I'm afraid. And God says, don't be afraid, and you say, I'm afraid. God says, don't be afraid, go in, and you say, no, I won't go in, I'm too scared. That's ungodly fear, because what you're actually telling God is, I don't believe you when you say you're going to take care of me. I don't believe you that you're going to fight for me. I don't believe that you're going to be able to defeat my enemies. Moses says, don't fear or be I can almost see Moses flashing back to those days. And it's important that this is Joshua here. Because remember, it was Joshua that stood against the people at Kadesh Barnea with Caleb and said, don't be afraid, let's go. Moses is giving him the same exhortation. So, in this whole section, this concluding, this exhortation section, the key is Moses is stepping aside and Joshua is going to be in charge. Israel, you don't have to be afraid. Not only because God is taking care of the leadership transition, but because God goes with you. Now, coming as this does at the end of the curses section, once again, the mention of Moses not making it into the land I think it serves a dual function. On the one hand, Moses is telling them, look, this is going to happen. On the other hand, I think the Israelites would finally be struck with the fact that even their great leader didn't make it into the land. Coming as it does on the heels of all these blessings and curses, coming as it does on the heels of God's recognition that, listen, there might be some of you who are saying, I'll get away with it. My heart is stubborn, but that's okay. I'll make it. This provides another example that, listen, no one is exempt from God's rules. No one is exempt from God's judgment. God is an equal opportunity punisher. Is he merciful? Yes. Does he put up with a lot? Yes. Is he patient? Yes. But nobody has a get out of judgment free card. Nobody has one. Not even, and not especially, you might say, Moses. And so I think in the function of this book, the fact that Moses has mentioned this a few times would serve as a pedagogical tool. It would serve to help Israel remember, listen, if Moses couldn't disobey and get away with it, what in the world makes me think that I can disobey and get away with it? We see this example in biblical history again. When David sins, he is the king. He doesn't get away with it. God's leaders are expected to obey just like everybody else. In fact, you'll remember in Deuteronomy 17, the law of the king specifically said that this king is supposed to make his own copy of the law. Why? So that he will learn to fear the Lord and his heart won't be lifted up above his people. Deuteronomy gives us a ruler and leaders who are under the same law as the people that they lead. They don't make themselves the exception because they're subject to the same judgment. After he provides for this transition in leadership, Moses then moves on to anticipate the day when future generations of Israelites will have to reaffirm this covenant. It was customary in the ancient Near East, in these treaties, for generations, subsequent generations of vassals, to reaffirm their allegiance to the great king, to the suzerain. And in this case, we see something very similar in verse 9 of chapter 31. Then Moses wrote this law, gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the same time, in the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at that place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, and the sojourner within your towns, so that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, as long as you live in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. The day is coming when future generations will rise who didn't go through all the things you went through in the wilderness. They didn't see the miracles. They didn't taste the manna. They didn't see you defeat Sihon and Og. They didn't see you cross the Jordan and defeat Jericho and Ai and Hatzor and all these. They didn't see any of it. How are they going to be integrated into the covenant community? We talked about the forward look of Deuteronomy. Here's another example. How are they going to be integrated in? Every 7 years, when you come for that Feast of Booths, everyone gets together and says the Pledge of Allegiance together. Right? I mean, not really. They read the law, they hear the law read to them, and they affirm in their hearts that, yes, they are a party to this covenant. That's the point. It's not just because they're bored. We need somebody to read the law to us. The idea is that they hear it and that they affirm in their hearts that they are part of this covenant, so that they will do the words of the law, even though those who have not known it, verse 13, even those who have not known it, that they may hear and learn to fear as long as you live in the land. Moses here is providing for a way to integrate future generations into the covenant community. I love that. It's a forward look. You know, I wish maybe elders would do that with young men and women that they send to Emmaus. Sometimes students come to Emmaus, and at the end of 4 years, they choose to not go home to the churches that sent them here. Sent them here is kind of broad statement, but yeah, they come from these homes, these churches, these assemblies. They come to Emmaus, and the elders encourage them, go off, go ahead, have a great time, learn a lot, and when you're done, you come on back and minister in the church. And at the end of 4 years, these students sit here and say, I ain't going back there. And there are a number of reasons why they don't want to go back. Some of them have to do with problems in the assembly. Some of them have to do with things they saw here that they have embraced and now don't want to let go of. But let me suggest to you that another reason is because at times those elders didn't do what Moses commanded Israel to do. They didn't look forward and plan on ways to keep that student integrated into the life of their church while that student was gone. Can you imagine the day when an elder says, all right, you're going off to Emmaus? We want you to know something. Every Christmas, we'll buy your plane ticket. You come home, and you'll preach twice on Sunday when you come. And in the summer, we'll pay for the gas for you to drive home, and you'll run our VBS, and we'll pay for you to get back to school, and we'll give you a scholarship when you go back. And at Thanksgiving time, maybe we'll only do it once, but we'd love for you to come back and testify, and we'll help you get back. We can't pay for your whole ticket, but we'll pay for half of it. And then in your senior year or your junior summer, we'll give you an internship because we want to see you back in this church every 6 months, every 4 months, and every summer. We want you to know you have a place here. I promise you, if a church did that, they would get those kids back when it's all over. But they don't. They send them off, don't write them a letter, don't call them. When the kid comes home, hey, welcome back, and that's it. I see Moses here trying to avoid that kind of situation. Get those people hearing the law. It is every 7 years. It's not every week. It's not every month. But the point is he's got a ceremony in place designed expressly for the purpose of reintegrating those subsequent generations into the covenant community. It's important. Otherwise, the children won't necessarily feel part of the covenant and be incented to obey. We get another commissioning of Joshua in chapter 14. If you can imagine that, this leadership issue must have been a big one. This time we get the words of the Lord. Chapter 31, verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days approach when you must die. Verse before, we had an exhortation to Joshua. Now we have this commissioning ceremony. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tent of meeting that I may commission him. And Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tent of meeting. Here it's the Lord that's laying the mantle of leadership on Joshua. Before it was Moses. The Lord appeared in the tent in a pillar of cloud, and the pillar of cloud stood over the entrance of the tent. The Lord said to Moses, behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers. Then this people will rise and whore after the foreign gods among them in the land that they are entering. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them. Then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them and hide my face from them, and they will be devoured. And many evils and troubles will come upon them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day, because of all the evil that they have done, because they have turned to other gods. So Joshua gets commissioned by the Lord at the tent of meeting. God appears. And now God takes up this issue of what's going to happen to Israel in the future. He does it in the context of the commissioning of Joshua. Notice that the commissioning continues in verse 23. Be strong and courageous. You shall bring the people of Israel into the land which I swore to give them. I will be with you. In between the calling of Joshua, the appearance of the Lord, and then that commissioning statement in verse 23, we get God's command to write a special song that's going to function as a witness against the people of Israel. Now, I think what he's doing is, Joshua, you're going to take leadership, and the leadership you're going to take is going to be full of problems, because these people are going to go after other gods. It doesn't historically end up happening in Joshua's generation. It happens after he dies, but he's anticipating what's going to happen in the future. We've seen that a little bit already. The anticipation of exile, the promise of restoration. Here it is again, this time in graphic detail. They're going to whore after other gods. And so God sets up a witness. That is a record, that is something to testify to Israel that he knew this was going to happen before it happened. If you saw the movie Quiz Show, you remember that the story is told in the movie of a guy who was incented to be part of a scam on one of these famous quiz shows, and they were giving him the answers to the questions ahead of time so that when he got on the show, he'd know what to say, ratings would go up, it was going to be a beautiful thing. Ratings were high because he kept winning, very likable fellow. The scam gets uncovered, and the investigators go back looking for previous contestants on the quiz show to see if they also had been part of the scam. And sure enough, they find one guy. And when the investigators come to the door, he says, I knew you'd be coming. Wait a minute. He goes into his house, and he comes back with an envelope. He says, I mailed this to myself the day or two before the quiz show. Inside the envelope were all the questions and answers that they had given him ahead of time. It was sealed and postmarked and unopened. So he had this document as what? As a witness that he knew ahead of time before the show aired, and because it had been stamped by the post office, it had the date on it, and there was no evidence it had been opened and tampered with. He gave that over as evidence to the FBI, and the whole case, they nailed those guys. God is doing something similar here. In this witness song, what he has, and this is going to be in chapter 32, what he has here is a testimony ahead of time. You see, Israel, I knew what you were going to do even before you went off and did it. Now, this witness song, this idea of a witness in the suzerain-vassal treaty is common in the ancient Near East. If you read a Hittite treaty, you will see that the Hittites and others as well, at the end of a treaty, would call witnesses to testify that each side had done what it should be doing. Now, in the case of the Hittites, of course, the witnesses are going to be the gods of their pantheon. So let me read a little bit. In the Mitanni land, a duplicate of this treaty has been deposited before Tesub. At regular intervals, they shall read it in the presence of the king of the Mitanni and in the presence of the sons of the Huri. Notice that. At regular intervals, they go and read the testimony, just like in Deuteronomy. Whoever will remove this tablet, the Lord of Kahat, or if he breaks it, or anyone else causes it to change the wording at the conclusion of this treaty, we have called the gods to be assembled, and the gods of the contracting parties to be present, to listen and to serve as witnesses. And then he lists a whole pile of gods. The sun goddess of this, and the storm god of that, and the Lord of heaven of that, and the Lord of aid of that, and the storm god of this, and on and on and on, including even and the mountains, the rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, heaven and earth, the winds and the clouds. The idea is when two parties make a deal, there will be witnesses to affirm whether or not both parties keep their sides of the contract. Well, guess what? The God of the Bible, well, there's nobody else beside him. So Yahweh's not going to call to witness who? Baal or Chemosh or Arena or Ahura Mazda. He's not going to call any of these gods to witness. There are no other gods. So he makes up a witness. And it's his own prophetic testimony. Verse 19 of chapter 31, write this song, teach it to the people of Israel, put it in their mouths, that the song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. For when I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and have grown fat, they will turn to other gods and serve them, despise me, and break my covenant. And when many evils and troubles have come upon them, this song will confront them as a witness. For it will live unforgotten in the mouths of their offspring. For I know what they are inclined to do even today, before I have brought them into the land that I swore to give. And so Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the people of Israel. In verse 23, Joshua is commissioned. And then in 24 through 28 through 29, God tells them where to put this book of the law. The deposit section reminds, as we read in this Hittite treaty, a copy of this contract, this treaty has been put in the temple. In this case, the words of the law are written, and in verse 25, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant, take this book of the law, put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. So, 2 copies. This is probably what's happening with the 10 Commandments. 2 tablets, one for God, one for the Israelites. Not 10, not 5 and 5 or 4 and 6, but rather 1 copy for God, who's one party to the treaty, and then 1 copy for the other person who is party to the treaty. And in this case, Israel has already been commanded to write the law upon stones. That could be interpreted as their copy. And then another copy is here put beside the ark of the Lord. Why would it be God's copy? Well, because the Israelites are never going to go into the Holy of Holies to see that ark. This is God's witness. The idea being, if Israel ever were to change those laws or say things like, well, we didn't know, God would pull out his copy and say, look, there it is. You see, I told you. So God gets his copy. And then Moses teaches them the song. Moses teaches them the song. We've seen a couple of witnesses. We've seen heaven and earth called as a witness against Israel. Why heaven and earth? Because they've been around since the day of creation. God has to call on something old. He can't call on another deity. They don't exist. So he calls heaven and earth because he created them and they've been around since the beginning. If anything has witnessed God's kindness and mercy to Israel, it's heaven and earth. So, chapter 32 begins, "Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. Let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, like shower upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Ascribe greatness to our God." The call of the witnesses in these first 4 verses is important. It's here God is here testifying, making his case in advance. The technical word for this kind of oracle is a reeve oracle. That's the way you pronounce it. It's spelled rib, but ribs are for Tony Romas, not reeve. A reeve is a lawsuit oracle. A lawsuit oracle. You need to understand God here as a prosecuting attorney standing before a jury or standing before a judge and making his case. The prophets are going to take up this theme. And I want to link for you for just a moment how the prophetic oracles work later in Israel's history. God, in chapter 32, is anticipating what the prophets are going to do to Israel over and over and over again. Passages like Isaiah chapter 1, verses 2 through 31, Micah chapter 1, verses 2 through 7, or chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, and Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 through 19. These prophets only predicted the future, a small portion of the time in their ministry. Most of the time, what the prophets were doing were functioning as covenant mediators, prosecuting attorneys, as it were, for the Lord. And in this, they were following what God was doing in chapter 31. The prophets stand there before God and between God and the people, and they say things like, "You guys are breaking the law. Look, didn't God say?" And then they go get the law. And they tell Israel and confront them with their sin. They are, as it were, God's prosecuting attorneys. The tone is a courtroom drama. It's Law and Order, biblical style. God does it here as an example in chapter 32, but the prophets are going to continue this theme throughout their ministry. So, for example, we read in Isaiah chapter 1, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand." Sounds very similar. Calling the witnesses and making his case before those witnesses. Micah chapter 1. "Hear, you peoples, all of you, pay attention, O earth and all that is in it. Let the Lord God be a witness against you, for the Lord is coming from his holy temple. The Lord is coming out of his place, and he will tread down and tread upon the high places of the earth." All of this, verse 5, is for the transgression of Jacob and for the sin of the house of Israel. These lawsuit oracles that the prophets bring up find their origin here in this witness song, the Song of Moses. Verses 1 through 4, call the witnesses. Verses 5 through 6, delineate the charges. Verse 5, "They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children, because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Is this how they repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is he not your Father who created you, who made you, who established you?" So the charges are laid out clearly. They're corrupt, they're twisted, they're wicked, and they have forgotten the God who made them. And then he brings out evidence, verses 7 through 18. So 1 through 4 call of witnesses. 5 and 6, the charges. 7 through 18, the evidence. And what does he do in these verses? He goes over all of the blessings that God gave to Israel. Remember the days of old. He fixed the borders of the people. The Lord's portion is his people. He found them in the desert. He took care of them, kept them as the apple of his eye. He guided them. He made them ride on high places. He brought them water and honey and curds. He gave them Bashan, the finest of wheat. Verse 15, but Jeshurun, another name for Israel, grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook the God who made him. Witnesses, charge, the evidence, and then the judgment, 19 through 35. We've seen this already, anticipated in the blessings and the curses, but the purpose of this song is so that it will live on in the memory of Israel, and as they sing it or recite it in the midst of their exile or judgment or famine, they'll say, oh yeah, he said this was going to happen. Let's repent. What is the punishment? Verse 19, the Lord saw it and spurned them. He said, I will hide my face from them. They have made me jealous with what is no God. Verse 23, I will heap disasters upon them. I will spend my arrows on them. They will be wasted with hunger. I will send the teeth of beasts against them. Listen, this is not a case of their sin has natural consequences, right? God's saying, I'm going to do this to them. Outdoors, the sword shall bereave. Indoors, terror. For young man and woman alike, the nursing child with the man of gray hair. I would have said, I will cut them to pieces. I will wipe them from human memory, had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant. It was not the Lord who did all this. I mean, hear the anger there. God says, the only reason I'm not wiping them out completely is because their enemies, who I'm using to punish them, would say things like, we're better than God. Look, we destroyed his people. They're all gone. But I would like to destroy all of you, he says. Why? Verse 28, they are a nation void of counsel. Vengeance is mine and recompense, verse 35. For the time when their foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and their doom comes swiftly. It's a difficult passage to hear, but in the middle of the judgment, God also gives mercy and vindication, of promise of future deliverance. Notice verse 36. The Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone, that there is none remaining, bond or free. Then he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge? Who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your protection. See now that even I am God. There is no God beside me. I kill, I make alive. I wound, I heal. There is none that can deliver out of my hand. For if I lift up my hand to heaven and swear, verse 40, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. My sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired heads of the enemy. Rejoice with him, O heavens. Bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. Okay, let me summarize. He calls the witnesses. He charges Israel with their sins. He gives evidence that he has done what's good for them and they rebuked him. He brings judgment upon them. But notice that there's a shift in the middle there. The enemies that God uses to bring judgment on his people, they misunderstand what's going on. In their mind, God is weak and they are super strong. And God says, no, that's not how it works. And he promises in verse 36, to vindicate his people. We have an example of this in the 8th century. The Assyrians come in, and God uses them to punish Israel, and they lift their hand up, and they say, we were stronger than Yahweh. And God says, because you said that, you're going down. And when the Assyrians go down, that is a vindication of his own people. The reason Israel is being punished is not because God is weak, but it's because his people are wicked. And even in the midst of this punishment, God promises future deliverance. Vindication. God will vindicate who? Israel or himself? There's an element of both. You might argue in this passage, more importantly, he's vindicating the faith his people have in him. Think about it. He's calling them to trust him. They've disobeyed. Now they're being judged. They remember the promises of future deliverance, and they're sitting there saying, is God going to do this? Can he do this? Answer, yes. He vindicates himself and the faith that his people have placed in him. It's an important song. Moses concludes in verse 44, Moses came and recited all the words of this song in the hearing of the people, he and Joshua the son of Nun. And when Moses had finished speaking all these words to all Israel, he said to them, take heart, all the words which I am warning you today, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is no empty word for you, but your very life. And by this word you will live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. Boy, Moses appears at times bipolar. You're going down, and it's going to be horrible. And then on the other hand, you see that hard, crusty exterior breaking down, and him saying, but you can do it. You can do it. Treat this as your life so that you'll go into the land and live a long time. That very day, the Lord spoke to Moses. Verse 48, go up this mountain and view the land and die on the mountain and be gathered, because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh. You did not treat me as holy. You shall not see the land before you. 3 times in this deposit implementation section, this issue of Moses not going into the land is mentioned. 3 times. And here again, at the end of this Song of Moses, it comes up one more time. As if to put a final exclamation point to the warning, do what's right so that you get into the land. Moses says, I didn't do what's right, and I'm not going into the land, but you can.